We're dealing with one of the most exciting chapters in the Bible. It's a chapter that deals with modern history and it deals with right now. And this chapter and verse 15 is right where we are now in the history of the world. And it gives us clues to what is happening and what will happen and action that we can take to be prepared for it. I love this chapter of the Bible. It's one that is really personal for each one of us because the events that it goes through around verse 15 are going to impact each one of us. And so what we want to do tonight is we want to go through the chapter, through Revelation 16, to show that much of it is fulfilled history and to use that to demonstrate that we are in the times described. And then I want to look at what is predicted for the near future and show that Christ is coming. Then also make it personal to us by considering whether we are prepared for Christ's coming. What does this mean and what we can do to be preparing? So we'll take the subject in three parts. First of all, we'll have a look at some background to the subject and some assumptions that we need to make for tonight. Then we'll have a look at Revelation chapter 16 to see where we are in history and how close we are to the return of Christ. And then we'll look at how we can prepare for the return of Christ. And really the emphasis needs to be on this preparing. Okay, so first of all, just to have a look at some background and some context. To get through the time we've got tonight, it's about 50 minutes, I have to assume a few things. So I'm assuming that you all believe in the reality of God and that he directs world affairs. I'm also assuming that you believe that the Bible is the word of God to mankind. Each of those are subjects on their own. We'll see some evidence of those tonight, but we don't have the opportunity to prove each one. So I'm going to assume that you believe this already. I'll give you some quick facts about the Bible just to help you understand a bit about the background and how it was written. So the Bible, we pick it up and we have one book, but it's in fact 66 individual books, and it's written over a period of 1,600 years or thereabouts by men in such divergent places as Rome and Babylon. It contains history, prophecy, poetry and letters. It's divided into two sections called Testaments, with 39 books in the Old Testament and 27 books in the New Testament. There's more than 40 authors in the Bible, and originally the Bible was written in three languages: Hebrew, Chaldee and Greek. And these languages have since been translated into many different languages, not only English. And so it's worth noting that the Bible in English is a translation and not the original language of the Bible. So as we go through the Bible tonight, keep those facts in mind and be impressed by the consistency of the message. We'll refer to a range of references in the Bible tonight, but because of the time, we won't be able to look up every Bible reference which is used. I'm going to take references tonight from the King James Version of the Bible, put some up on the screen, and others will actually turn up. It's a good way to get familiar with your Bible. It's also a good idea to write the references down, and the worksheet should help you to with taking notes, but also, obviously there may be other things that you want to note down as well. So it should help you get the essentials and help you to go over things later. As I mentioned, there's a map on the back, and we'll look at that shortly when we get into some description of these vials that we've just read about in Revelation chapter 16. So let's now have a look at a verse from the Bible which we can use as a reference point for everything which has happened in the world and is going to happen. And that is the book of Numbers, so the fourth book of the Bible, Old Testament, Numbers chapter 14, verse 21. And here is where God describes his purpose. That's the first point on your sheet. God says, "As truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord." So God's glory is his name and his character. And as we read through the Bible, we find that God wants to fill the earth with his glory through people who are reflections of what he is like. But that verse there, we've got there, is the purpose of God. That's why he created the earth. That's why we're here. That's ultimately why history has happened the way that it has. And so, as I said, that's the first verse to write down on your worksheet. And keep that purpose in mind as we go through the rest of this subject. All right, let's move on now to have a look at this section about Jesus Christ coming. Sorry? Oh, good. Good to see the COVID protocols being observed. So it may be worth asking ourselves here, just who is Jesus Christ? Now, that may seem obvious, but let's just remind ourselves, especially if you're coming to this subject for the first time. Here's what the Bible says about Jesus. Now, we can't look at all of these references, but you might want to just write the quotes down there so that you've got those to look up later. So the first thing that we see there is that Jesus is the Son of God. Luke chapter 1, verse 35. Right, that's just a fact. We can't look that up now, but we need to just understand that Jesus is the Son of God. We also need to understand that Jesus preached the gospel, particularly the good news of God's kingdom. Matthew chapter 4, verse 23. We find that the purpose of Jesus is to save his people from their sins. That's a whole subject on its own as well, but that comes out from Matthew chapter 1, verse 21. We find that Jesus did not sin, and in doing that, he successfully overcame human nature. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 22. We find that Christ was crucified and then resurrected to eternal life. Acts chapter 2, verse 23 to 24. We find that Jesus went to heaven and sits at God's right hand now. Colossians chapter 3, verse 1. And we find that he will return from heaven to earth. Acts chapter 1, verse 11. So when we think about our topic tonight, Christ is coming. Are you ready? He's coming from heaven. So we can see from that list of Bible verses that we're dealing with a unique human being, someone with a close connection with God, and someone who we might actually think is worth having back here on earth. All right, let's keep moving. So how can we be confident that Jesus Christ is coming? It is a bold claim. Well, we have the evidence of the Bible. There is what Jesus said himself at various times. He spoke various stories called parables where he talked about coming back, so implying, of course, that he expected to go and come again. And then we get very direct verses like this one from the book of Acts. So the first book of the New Testament after the Gospels talks about how the gospel was preached in the Roman Empire. And right at the start of that verse, of that book, Jesus has gone to heaven, and his 12 disciples, those who followed him closely during his time here on earth, are just sort of standing there, watching, because he's gone, and they don't quite know what to do now. And suddenly 2 angels are there, and they say to these men, "Ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus which is taken up from you into heaven shall so come in like manner as ye have seen him go into heaven." So there's a very direct promise there that Jesus is coming back to the earth. We also have the words of prophets in the Old Testament. And for example, if you were here a couple of weeks ago, you would have heard the presentation on the prophecy of Daniel, where the prophet Daniel interpreted the dream of King Nebuchadnezzar, and he described the stone smashing into the feet of the image that the king was dreaming about, which then led to God setting up an everlasting kingdom. And this prophecy points to the return of Jesus Christ. So that's Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44 particularly. Last week we saw a similar reference in Ezekiel chapter 37, particularly verse 23, which also talks about the times of Jesus returning to the earth. And so we've got these prophecies over time through the Bible about Jesus coming back to the earth. And so we can be confident that Christ is coming. But if we already have those sorts of verses, why would we use Revelation 16 when it comes to a topic like this? Because Revelation chapter 16 gives us a good idea of the timing of Christ's return. And it also shows the impact on us. And they are the words of Christ himself here in Revelation. Now, to get to grips with this chapter and what it's saying about the return of Christ, we do need to have a high-level understanding of the book of Revelation. And the start of the book sets some context for this in Revelation chapter 1, verse 1. Now, we will look this one up. Those points on the screen are what we can draw from this particular verse. So, Revelation chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. And he sent and signified it by his angel unto his servant John." Now that verse sets up the book of Revelation really well. You can see the points on the screen, the key points that come out of this particular verse. So the book of Revelation, these are the words of Jesus Christ, okay? So the very same Jesus Christ who's coming back to earth, he was the one who dictated this book of Revelation to his servant John. The words that he gave are given to his servants particularly. So we're talking about people here who already know about Jesus and his message. So they've got some background when it comes to understanding the book of Revelation. The book is setting up events that were in the future at the time that Jesus gave them. And so you've sort of got this ongoing, unfolding timeline, if you like, of history that was going to occur from that point on up to our own day and also beyond our time as well. And it also says there, through the use of that word signified it, that it's going to use symbolic language. And that's key to understand this. Some of the imagery in the book of Revelation is quite dramatic and graphic, I guess you might say as well, and it's not immediately clear what it can be. But here in the first verse, it's an indication or showing that that's what we should expect to find in this book of Revelation. And so we'll see symbolic language used as we go through this subject, and it's not just in Revelation, it's elsewhere as well. So we'll have a look at what these symbols mean, but not going to be able to look at the proof, okay? We can talk about that afterwards if you want to, but meanwhile I just need you to go with me on this. So back to Revelation chapter 16, and we need to pick up a little bit of context for that, and we actually find that back in Revelation chapter 11. And in Revelation chapter 11 verse 13 we read about a great earthquake. There's 3 great earthquakes in Revelation. This is the second one, and we've seen a bit of seismic activity with the volcano recently in Tonga, and I'm sure you all understand what an earthquake will do and how disruptive it is, just to understate things, in the terms of its impact on the earth. And so when we think about what an earthquake might represent symbolically, we're talking about what we might call an earth-shattering event, but in a figurative sense. And so this earthquake here in Revelation chapter 11 verse 13 is the French Revolution, which happened in 1789 and in the years afterwards, but particularly kicked off in 1789. So that's the context for Revelation chapter 16. The chapters sort of 12, 13, 14 talk about the experiences of Christ's true followers at the hands of the Catholic Church. And then we get to chapter 15 that says that the Catholic Church, or the beast, will be destroyed. And then from verse 5 we start to get the description of the vials. So in Revelation chapter 15 now, verse 5, "After that I looked," says John, "and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened, and the 7 angels came out of the temple, having the 7 plagues, clothed in pure and white linen, and having their breasts girded with 7 golden girdles. And one of the 4 beasts gave unto the 7 angels 7 golden vials, full of the wrath of God, who liveth for ever and ever." And so that launches then into chapter 16. So what we're going to understand is that we're dealing with God's judgments on the Catholic system. Remember also this is a prophecy at the time that it was given, and so not all of the descriptions or symbols would have been understood by the writer. But by knowing the timing of the chapter and the aim of the book, we can determine what these symbols mean. And the key, I'll say it again, to the vials is to remember one of the basic themes of Revelation, which is God versus the Roman Catholic system. I don't want to sugarcoat that, that's what it's about. All the vials are in some way related to God's judgments on this Catholic power, and indeed it finally finishes that power off. So as we've said, the vials start in 1789 and they finish not far into the future from now. So at this stage, they cover only 233 years. And the history of these years is very well documented, and it involves one key element, which is the element of war. It's something to watch out for as we go through this chapter as well. In the descriptions of war that we find is the toughness of this Catholic system. Look for the effort which has to go into destroying it. It doesn't just lie down and die, it fights every step of the way. To put some of the history into context, there's several main players that come into this chapter. The first of them is Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a French general and emperor. We also have the office of the Pope. There's multiple popes that are impacted in this chapter, but they're all in that same capacity. And the third main player is the Emperor of Austria, who was also the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The bulk of the action takes place in and around Europe, but the Middle East is also involved as well, and that's what's covered on the map on the back of your worksheet. So what I'm going to do now is just step through a brief description of the first 6 vials. The 7th vial hasn't happened yet, we'll get to that, but we'll step through the first 6 vials. I'll have a description on the screen, but also I'll show you on a map where each vial occurs. And so on your map on the back of your worksheet there, you might just want to circle each area and right next to it, vial 1, vial 2, etc. And that'll give you a visual depiction of where these vials occurred. And it's interesting when you start to circle them to see the overlap that occurs, and it really focuses our attention on the main area that is impacted here. So the first of the vials was poured out on the earth, and it affected those allied to the Catholic system, which is the beast. So the church and its followers were those hit by the contents of the first vial. It says in verse 2 that it was poured out upon the earth, and there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image. So this noisome and grievous sore is a malignant ulcer. It's a bit like, or it's the same as the murrain of beasts in the 10 plagues that struck Egypt back in the book of Exodus. And a malignant ulcer is one that spreads, and it affects a wider and wider area. So the effects of the first vial were local at first, and then they spread. So what does it represent? Well, the last major event in Revelation before the vials is the second great earthquake, which I've mentioned, which is the French Revolution. So the first vial is describing the effects of the revolution. The upheaval had been aimed at the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the church, and it hit all of them hard, and the Catholic Church in France was in disarray. Surrounding nations watched the effects of the French Revolution, and they feared that the same thing could happen to them, that it could spread. And they felt that the only way to put an end to the threat was to invade France and restore the former order. They massed armies along the French borders, but the armies of the French Republic, under this man Napoleon, repelled them back, and eventually Napoleon was given the command of the whole of the French army. So if we look at our map, the effects of the first vial are there in France and along the borders of France as the surrounding nations tried to invade, to take back or to restore the previous order. So the second vial, it says, was poured out on the sea, and the sea became as the blood of a dead man, and every living soul died in the sea. Now Napoleon, of course, is completely unaware that he's being controlled by God and that he's only there to judge the Holy Roman Empire, and he wanted to establish a French empire. And to gain the domination that he wanted, he needed to knock out England, who had control of the sea. But Napoleon failed to win at sea. The English blockaded Napoleon's ports and effectively isolated him in Europe, which is the area, of course, where God had planned for him to work. Interesting that Napoleon's invasion into Egypt and his invasion into Russia also didn't work. So Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Trafalgar, most notably, which is off the southwest coast of Spain, by Lord Nelson here, sailing his famous ship, the Victory, and it did lead to a famous victory for the English. And so the red circle there is where the Battle of Trafalgar took place, but the effects of the vial were more widespread than that, in that they really cut off shipping around Europe, and sea traffic ceased to circulate, just like the blood of a dead man ceases to circulate. So that's the first and the second vials. Vials 3, 4 and 5. The third vial was poured out on the rivers and fountains of waters. So remembering the vials are directed against the Catholic system, we have to look for an area which corresponds to this description within its territory. And we find it in the Alpine areas to the north of Italy and in Switzerland, around those kinds of areas. I'll just jump forward to the map and you can see the green circle there. Vial 3 is the area that we're talking about for this one. And here is where there's many, the rise of many great European rivers and also a lot of lakes in this area. Napoleon invaded this area because of a threat from forces who wanted to overthrow the French Republic and return it to a monarchy. So that idea hadn't gone away. Napoleon was very, very successful, and between 1796 and 1797, so only a couple of years, he fought and won 26 battles, and he gained complete control over northern Italy. To look at the fourth vial, we find, in verses 5 through to 7, we find an acknowledgement that what is happening is justified. The angels of the waters say that God is right in pouring out these judgments because of what the Catholics have done to God's servants. And this gives us further evidence of who is being judged, because no one has persecuted the servants of God more than the Catholic system. The fourth vial is poured out on the sun. Now, we'll see a little bit later, the sun, moon and the stars are representative of political leaders, and in this case the sun is the Holy Roman Emperor. I mentioned him before. But he wasn't taken out without a fight. Having the vial poured on him gave him power to scorch men with fire, it says here. The Austrians and others who were being led by this Holy Roman Emperor just wouldn't give up on trying to get rid of Napoleon. And in 1805, an alliance made up of Austrians, Russians and English declared war on Napoleon. The ensuing battles saw many scorched by the heat which they generated. But in 1805, Napoleon was completely victorious over this alliance and had ended the Holy Roman Empire from a political point of view. Now, the Austrians were the Pope's key allies, and the Austrian Emperor also held the title of the Holy Roman Emperor. And so with his comprehensive defeat, the Holy Roman Empire was finished. Verse 9 gives us a clue to the toughness of the system which is being judged. Despite the scorching heat of the fourth vial, there's no repentance, no acknowledgement that it's caused by God for a particular reason. Instead, they blaspheme God, either for causing the problem or for not doing anything about it. And that attitude also comes out in verse 11. The fifth vial was poured out, just go forward to the map. You can see the fourth vial there is the one in orange, so it's the area for the fourth vial. The fifth vial was poured out on the seat of the beast. So although the Holy Roman Empire was finished, the Pope still held power. You can see they are not giving up lightly. And the fifth vial covers Napoleon's dealings with the Pope. And a succession of popes opposed Napoleon, so he simply arrested them and took them back to France, getting rid of all their power. And that's an easy way to sort that one out. And so you can see there the fifth vial occurs in the area of Rome. And so now the religious side of the Holy Roman Empire was also done away with, and the empire was really at an end after about 1,000 years. With its political and religious lights gone, the territory of the beast was plunged into darkness, as it says here in Revelation chapter 16. The sixth vial shifts the focus in being poured out on the great river Euphrates. And looking at the area of the Euphrates, which is more over into sort of Iraq and that sort of area of the Middle East, we find that it was the territory of the Ottoman or Turkish Empire. And it did a job against the Catholics, but now it is to shrink so that the way of the kings of the East might be prepared. And these kings coming through to continue and indeed finish off the job on the Catholics. And so a river dries up from the edges, and so it has been with the Turkish Empire. It once covered heaps of the Middle East and extended well into Western Europe, and it was one of the most powerful of the world's empires. But between 1820 and 1920, it went from huge to virtually nothing, becoming the country that we know today as Turkey. So the purpose of the drying up was so that the way of the kings of the East might be prepared, and therefore perhaps the most significant area to be dried is the land of Israel, because that is the area from which the great king will rule. Israel, or Palestine as it was at the time, was captured by the British and their allies in World War I, and this freed the land from the Ottoman oppression and opened up the way for the eventual rebirth of the nation of Israel. And Australia was involved in this bit, as you can see there on the screen, and it's in the 6th vial events that the famous charge of the light horse at Beersheba took place. And it's interesting to find a joint issue Australian and Israeli stamp commemorating that event. It mentions kings here in Revelation 16. You can probably guess who they are, but it's proved by a couple of verses that we haven't got time to look at. Malachi 4 verse 2 speaks of the Son of Righteousness arising, and Matthew 13 verse 43 speaks of the righteous shining as the sun, which applies to the saints. And that's why it's prepared not for a singular king, but for kings plural. So hopefully with that map, and you can see the overlap of the circles there, you can see how these impact of the vials really hit Europe and hits that sort of seat of power of the Catholic Church. So after the drying up of the Euphrates comes the 3 frogs. But John didn't actually see real frogs. He saw 3 unclean spirits, and they looked like frogs. And they came from the mouths of the false prophet, the beast, and the dragon, which are all aspects of the Catholic system. And they influence the whole world. But interesting to think, why do we look at, or why are they called frogs? Why not use scorpions or something else that's probably a bit more painful? Because frogs identify the country in which the influential doctrines of these unclean spirits originated. And this came out in the talk that we had here a few weeks ago. The country or vicinity that these unclean spirits come from is the French, who've long been known by the nickname frogs, and on whose heraldry frogs have appeared in the past. And so these spirits came out of France. What might those spirits be? Think back to the earthquake, the French Revolution, and its effects were felt right around the world with its doctrines of liberty, equality and fraternity, or brotherhood, equality. They wanted to be all together as one. Even when they executed the king, it wasn't the execution of King Louis, it was Citizen Louis. So they tried to put everyone on an equal footing and treat everyone as a brotherhood. These doctrines have seen their manifestation in people power and the way that the world acts today. The way these doctrines have taken the world is also leading to the great day of God Almighty, as we see in verse 14 in Revelation chapter 16, that the spirits, they are the spirits of devils working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth and the whole world to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. Probably not what they were expecting to do when they got out there, but that's the way that God is using them. The day is a frequent theme in the Old Testament prophecies, speaking of the day of God's fulfilling of his promises, and it's also the day when he will judge the world in righteousness, Acts 17 verse 31. I want to jump verse 15 now and just have a look at verse 16. The nations are gathered together to a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. Now verse 16 hasn't happened yet, up to verse 14 has happened. And so those first 6 vials get us through relatively recent history to today, and the next thing that's due to happen is the return of Christ, and after that is when we get the 7th vial. Armageddon is then when there is the revealing of Christ and his saints, and then the final destruction of the Catholic Church. And so when we look at what has happened and what's still to come, that puts us right in verse 15. I said at the start that we could pinpoint our place in time in the Bible. Here it is, verse 15. I've actually got now written next to verse 15. What does Jesus say here in verse 15? Behold, I come as a thief. Blessed is he that watcheth and keepeth his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. So there's no mucking around here particularly. The return of Christ is imminent. Christ says he's coming as a thief though, so it's sort of unexpected. Not many people are going to be expecting it or will see it coming. But then he issues guidance for everyone, and he speaks personally to those who are hearing his words. This is us. Think about this. This is Jesus speaking straight to us, and here's what he says. Blessed is he that watcheth and keepeth his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. These are words of blessing and words of warning. And so what does he say here? He says that he is coming. He says he will not be expected. He says that there's a blessing for those who watch for him and are prepared, and there's a warning for those who do not maintain a state of readiness. Now the word blessed here means fortunate or well off or happy. For us, you could say that you're onto a good thing. So that's a positive. Why is it a good thing? Because it means being part of God's purpose, that purpose we looked at back at the start of the talk. The warning there is in losing that garment. We'll have a look at the garment later on, but in ending up very embarrassed. So there's two particular things that Jesus talks about here. He talks about watching and about keeping your garments. And coming straight after his warning that he's coming as a thief, it's these two things that are key to being prepared for Christ's return. But it's also interesting that Christ is using terms here that he's used before. And so we'll now go in and expand this section out and use some of Christ's other words to understand some more of what he's talking about. It's worth perhaps thinking about why we might want to be prepared too. Why would we not just hang off and wait for Christ to come back and deal with the impact then? Well, expecting Christ's return gives us a sense of purpose, for one thing. It's also a response, or can be a response, to something greater, and this again is a subject on its own, but the idea that man is created to look for something beyond what we have in life now. It's also a desire to be part of God's purpose, which we saw in Numbers 14, verse 21. So first of all, let's have a look at watching. So the purpose of watching is so that we can keep our garments. What do we watch for? Well, in the context of the verse, we are being told to watch for Christ's return. He says in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, verse 28, "When ye see these things come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draws near." We'll have a look at what those things are shortly. But you can see there that there's this expectation of redemption, of being saved, if we're aware and looking for Christ's return. Now, Jesus using the term watch is not new. In fact, it is entirely consistent that he should use it in Revelation because he's used it before. Come to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13, and we'll have a look at some verses here that really go into this. So in Mark chapter 13, Jesus is talking about various events that are going to happen in the future, including the destruction of Jerusalem. So this is the future from the time when he was on the earth. And then in verse 26, he talks about his own return. So again, he had this expectation that he would go and then come back. He says in verse 26, "Then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory." The Son of Man is a term that Jesus uses about himself. So he says he's going to come, which of course implies that he's also going to go. But in verse 32, he then says that no one knows when he's coming back except God. Verse 32, "Of that day and that hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels which are in heaven, neither the Son." So he didn't even know himself, but the Father. But he wants people to be ready for him to come back. And so he gives a warning, which is a lot like what he gives in Revelation. Read verse 33, "Take ye heed, watch and pray, for ye know not what the time is." And so he's giving that same warning there to take heed and to watch. And then he gives a little story to make his point. He talks about a man going on a journey without giving a return date. He says, "For the Son of Man is as a man taking a far journey, who left his house and gave authority to his servants and to every man his work, and commanded the porter to watch." So there's his little story that he gives. And then he says, the lesson I want you to learn from this story is in verse 35. "Watch ye therefore, for ye know not when the master of the house cometh, at even or at midnight or at the cock crowing or in the morning, lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. And what I say unto you, I say unto all, watch." So what does he expect the servants to do? He expects them to be active in looking after the master's property and to watch for the master's return. And he applies that story to us. Now, if you've got a coloured pencil, I would suggest colouring in the words watch that come out there. Hopefully you've spotted them. There's 4 of them there. Verse 33, watch and pray. Verse 34, commanded the porter to watch. Verse 35, watch ye therefore. And verse 37, I say unto all, watch. So if you've got a pencil, I would colour that in. It really jumps out from the page, and you can see in a fairly small amount of verses, that's really the key theme. That's what he's trying to tell people. He says it to start with, very plainly in verse 33, watch and pray. Then he gives a story where he also says he asks people in the story to watch, and then he says, I want you to learn that same lesson. I want you to watch as well. And then verse 37, he really expands it out. I'm talking to you disciples, but I'm saying it to everybody else as well. I say it to all, watch. And so it's no surprise when we get to Revelation 16 to find he uses the term watch. Now the same lesson is put in a slightly different way in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12, verse 37, where he picks up on that term blessed, which we've looked at before. He says there, blessed are those servants who the Lord, similar to the master in Mark, when he comes shall find watching. But then verse 39, this know that if the good man of the house had known when the thief, there's that term again, was coming, he would have watched and not have suffered his house to be broken through. So the idea is that not watching results in loss. And I think it's interesting to look at the contrast there. If you watch, there's a blessing. If you don't watch, you're going to suffer loss. And a couple of other verses there you can see on the screen where this story starts to come out as well. So there's this emphasis on this continued watching, but also drawing this contrast now between the blessing that comes from watching and the loss that comes from not watching. And I think it's also worth looking, or just emphasising from Mark chapter 13, that watching triggers action. Sorry, I have got an incorrect verse on there. That should be verse 34, where he commands every man to work. But the idea that watching is not just sitting there like a deer in the headlights watching, it's actually triggering action as well. We can look at Luke 21, verse 36. It says there to watch and pray that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass and stand before the Son of Man. So there's a benefit there in watching as well, because you're going to escape things that were going to come to pass. And so you can see the consistency of the warning to watch, but you also start to see building the reasons why. There's a loss if we do not watch. There's a blessing if we do. There's also escape if we do. And there is this warning. Jesus' return will cause upheaval and disruption in the world. Revelation 16, later on in the chapter, we get the third earthquake, right? So we already saw the earthquake that was the French Revolution. The third earthquake, which comes up in Revelation 16, is the return of Christ. So that will be a massively disrupting event for the world as well. And watching is a way to minimise the impact of that on ourselves. But what sort of things do we watch for? For Christ, who is the returning master. So that's overall what we need to watch out for. But what might that be like? What sorts of things should we look out for? So Christ, we've already looked at Christ's words and seen in the Gospels that he has this consistent theme of watching. And so we can also look in the Gospel for clues for what we should be looking out for. So he gives us these clues, but he doesn't give us a map, okay? Remember, he said no one knows the day or the hour when Jesus is coming. Otherwise, you just put a mark on the calendar and get on with life until that particular day. So think about it. Perhaps we take an illustration. If you had to get from here to the airport, but you didn't know where it was and you didn't have a map or a phone, okay, what might you do to find the airport? Well, you could walk out to a high vantage point and have a look around and watch out for planes, and you could see the direction that they might be headed in. So that would be a clue, and then you could head that way yourself. And then you might see a bus that says airport transport. So, okay, I must be getting into the vicinity, and keep heading that way. And then you'd start to see some signs, and you'd be able to follow the signs and find your way. And so watching out for Christ's return is similar in that he tells us what to watch out for, clues along the way. So the first of the things to have a look at there is political signs. And if we come across to the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 21, I've already referred to Luke chapter 21, but we'll get a sense again in symbolic language, but we get a sense of the sorts of things that we should be looking out for. So we looked at verse 28, which said, when you see these things, then lift up and look up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. Just prior to that, Christ is talking about things that will be going on in the world before he returns. So we go back to verse 24. They shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. That starts to set the timing for this. Okay, so if you were here last week, you would have understood that Jerusalem came fully into Israeli or Jewish hands in 1967. So verse 24 is 1967, so we can place ourselves after that. That event was a sign at the time, and it is one that has been fulfilled. And so in the following verses in Luke 21, we're between 1967 and the return of Christ. What does Jesus say that time will be like? What should we be watching out for? Well, it says, there shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken, and then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. So the sun, the moon and the stars here represent political powers, and the sea represents the nations. And I like that word perplexity in there as well. It means no way out. You can see the word exit is in that word. And so you can see that what it's talking about is turmoil amongst the nations of the world, both at a leadership and a population level, with no solution to the problem. Do we see that in the world today? Absolutely we do. We've just gone past the 1-year anniversary of the storming of the Capitol building in Washington, DC. America as a country is divided, and it's becoming even more so. We've got the rising belligerence of Russia on the borders of Ukraine at the moment. Here in Australia, we've been affected by the rising antagonism of China. We look at the turmoil the world has been thrown into by COVID-19 over the last couple of years. Even before that, we could go back to 2016 and the Brexit saga. The world just lurches from one crisis to the next, just as the Bible said we should expect. And so watch for continuing political turmoil in the world. It's building and it's becoming more impactful. If we think back to the last couple of lectures we've had here over the last couple of weeks, we've seen an emphasis on Russia and Europe. So watch those areas as well. What is Russia up to? How is Europe behaving? Here in Australia, we may be more worried about China, but from the perspective of watching for Christ's return, it's Russia and Europe and the Middle East where our focus needs to be. Where are alliances going in those regions? We saw last week the nations of Ezekiel chapter 38 described. Watch to see who is lining up with who. Are we seeing those alliances coming together? So we're to watch what is going on politically in the world. But Jesus also brings it a lot closer to home by talking about social conditions in the world too. In Matthew 24, verse 37, he says that as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Son of Man, of course, being one of those titles that Jesus gives to himself. So if we can identify what that time period was like, we've got something else to watch out for that will tell us how close Christ's return is. The days of Noah are described back in the first book of the Bible in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. So Genesis 6 verse 5, it says there, God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And so there's the description from God's point of view of what the world had got to. Imagination means the purposes and desires of man, and it wasn't pleasant. It was evil, and evil continually. No thoughts for God and no sense of humanity. It was all about self. Verse 13 says that the earth was filled with violence. And Jesus, when he uses these words, adds that the population of the earth was eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the great flood came and wiped them out. And they had no idea that God was about to judge them for their behaviour and way of life, which completely ignored him. And that's key. Does that sound familiar? Yep. The world is focused on itself today. In general, there is no acknowledgement of God. We are living in days that are like the days of Noah. There's a further example of this in Luke chapter 17, where Jesus says, likewise also as it was in the days of Lot. They did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded. But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Now Lot was the nephew of the great patriarch Abraham, and he lived in the city of Sodom, down beside what is now the Dead Sea in Israel. His era is described as we've just read, eating and drinking, buying, selling, planting, building. Now you might say there's nothing wrong with that, but in the case of Sodom, they were all destroyed. So why would that have been? Because again, the focus was all about self. God was not part of their lives or consciousness, and they also indulged in extreme immorality. 2 angels came to Sodom to get Lot out, and they told him to warn his family of the impending destruction of the city. But Genesis tells us that the words of Lot seemed like idle tales to his future sons-in-law. There was just no consciousness of God, and they were all doing their own thing, including that serious immorality in God's eyes as well, and they were all destroyed. I think that the warning is in ignorance of God. Ignorance of God is leading people further and further from the moral basis that has been the foundation of society for so long. That is another sign for us to watch out for, moral decline. It seems that the further that society is moving away from God, the closer we are getting to Christ's return. So watch out for society's attitude to God and the Bible and the morality associated with it. The further society moves away, either drifting or by design, the closer we're getting to Christ's return. But Christ's words in Revelation 16 verse 15 are not just about watching, it's also about responding to what we see. There is personal action involved in this verse as well, if we want to be blessed. Now we might be excellent watchers and could tell everyone about the closeness of Christ's return, but without doing anything ourselves in response to what we're seeing, we're only doing half the job. It's like sitting on your front veranda watching, but in the meantime, the house and garden are going to rack and ruin. It's not just watch, it's watch and keep his garments. And keep has the idea of guard. So there's 2 things here in Revelation 16 verse 15. And why do you keep your garments? So that you keep them on and don't end up naked and exposed to everyone around you. Now that might sound like a pretty extreme thing to say, but Jesus is actually drawing on some stories from elsewhere in the Bible and using them to make a particular point about preparation. He's not talking about literal clothing, he's talking about how we act, what our way of life is like, whether we're living like we're expecting Christ to return, whether we're actively maintaining a state of readiness as we see the various signs in the world that tell us that Christ is coming. Now, there's 3 stories that Jesus is drawing from there when it comes to this symbol of garments. And these 3 examples explain, I think, why Jesus chose to use that symbol. The first of those is in Genesis chapter 3, the sin of Adam and Eve. There was a need to cover what became the shame of their nakedness. In Exodus chapter 32 verse 25 we have the story of the children of Israel worshipping the golden calf. They became involved in worshipping a false god. They went away from the true God, and as part of that false worship they ended up naked, it says in Exodus 32 verse 25, to their shame among their enemies. And in Matthew 22 there, verse 11 to 12, is a parable spoken by Jesus. Here was a wedding guest who tried to attend the wedding without meeting the requirements of guests to wear a particular garment. This man was trying to do things his own way, and it didn't work out because he got cast out of the wedding feast. So in each of these examples, people went away from the commands of God and lost their garments. And they were all punished because of that. Adam and Eve lost the beautiful Garden of Eden. Many of the Israelites lost their lives. And the wedding guest, of course, was kicked out of the wedding feast. So that shows why Jesus used that figure of speech in Revelation. Are we going to follow his way and therefore keep our garment? or are we going to go away from that and suffer loss? In this case, the loss of that everlasting kingdom. So, what might keeping our garments look like? There's a verse in the New Testament, Ephesians chapter 4, it's verse 24, which talks about putting on the new man, like changing our clothes. And it's referring to the change that we commit to when we are baptised, committing our lives to Christ. Need to keep moving through these a bit more, but Ephesians chapter 4 goes on to describe that change that Jesus is looking for when we take on the new man. It's this way of life that's represented by keeping our garments. Another verse that comes up there, or another chapter which is great to have a look at, is Matthew chapter 25. There's two stories in Matthew chapter 25. The parable of the 10 virgins going to a wedding feast. The bridegroom only recognised half of them. The bridegroom recognised Jesus. He only recognised the half who had put in the time to match their characters to his. And so there's again an example of something that we can do. Later on in Matthew 25, we've got another example about Jesus when he is judging who is going into the kingdom. And we'll just try and quickly turn this one up because it's a good example to have a look at. Matthew chapter 25. Jesus tells those who go into the kingdom why they've been given that position, and they question why. They said, we've never seen you in this position that you've described yourself as being in, and us helping you. And Jesus says, they say in verse 37, then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered and fed thee, or thirsty and gave thee drink? When saw we thee a stranger and took thee in, or naked and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick or in prison and came unto thee? And the king shall answer and say unto them, verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. And so in that short parable it talks about Jesus' expectations, because the opposite is the case for those who were rejected. Clearly Jesus is going to call out those who aren't ready, and their lack of readiness will be open for all to see. The verse I like that really I think sums up the way of life of a servant of Jesus is James chapter 1 verse 27, which says, pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. So to keep our garments is to keep life and conscience in order before God. And if you're looking for a little summary of what keeping our garments is, I think that little sentence there captures that. So we've looked at watching and we've looked at keeping our garments, and I think that summarises what preparation is. The preparation is about watching the world and watching ourselves and acting on what we see. So we've seen tonight that Christ's return is imminent. We've seen how Jesus expects us to prepare. The implication for us is in the outcome of the preparation we put in. And that's what we need to realise, and what I think we need to take away from tonight. God's purpose will be fulfilled. He will fill the earth with his glory. In a small way that's happening now as people take on the new man. But it will begin in earnest with the imminent return of Jesus Christ. Will we welcome Jesus Christ when he comes, with our garments securely around us? Or will we be ambivalent or actively antagonistic, which will lead to loss? Our world at the moment is out of control. Jesus will bring control. His return to earth offers the way out of what is happening in the world at the moment. And so we are invited to prepare for that return now. Thank you.